For Zianda, it's going to be a very busy week as she covers those elections in the US. So let's stay with them. We speak now to international relations expert Brooks Spector, who's also associate editor for the Daily Maverick. We've been talking about how it's going to be a busy week ahead of us, and it's something that you've written about as well, and we'll get into that in a moment. Brooks, thanks for giving us your time. I want to start with this, though. As we get into the week for South Africans, why they should be watching this all-important election in the US.
Well, I mean, good evening. Good to be with you. I mean, the sort of the obvious answer is the United States looms large on international affairs, on international trade, and a whole host of interconnected issues, many of which affect South Africa. For example, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which gives unfettered non-tariff access to American markets, has a significant impact on South Africa in manufacturing and agricultural commodities that might well be under threat. It comes up for renewal next year if a foreign policy and an international economic policy by a president is starkly transactional and insists on a whole range of quid pro quos. That could be an issue. The idea that foreign assistance in its many different forms might be at issue as well. All of these things affect South Africa and South Africans fairly directly, but the larger international climate obviously has an impact because South Africa is largely an export-driven country, and you need the stability of the international trading regime for the country's success. And I guess also in a little more indirect a way, the defense of democracy as a concept, both domestically in the US and internationally, has ramifications for this country as well. So I think South Africans should be concerned, should be interested, should be intrigued, and should be engaged with what transpires in the United States in the next number of days. You don't get a vote, but you do certainly have a stake.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting and quite a bit of education as well to see just how some various states in the US would go about implementing and going out to vote, very different to what we do here in some cases. Where in Oregon, for instance, 1 million votes have already been turned in because they received via mail. So very, very interesting. But let's talk about what you've written, because one of the big issues around this particular election for the US is just how difficult it is to call which way it's going to go. You've talked about how this very election could very well see the Senate switch party control. You've talked about the House of Representatives likely to do the same. But because of how close it is to call, you've also said that after the results are announced, you may very well see more of a discussion around the quality of those results because of how tight it is.
Well, it's true. If the results are very, very close. I mean, if the margin is, is in small numbers, you're going to see almost certainly the engagement of lawyers to demand recounts or to demand inspections of the ballots and so forth. Something of a rerun of what happened in part in 2016 and 2020. As well as in the year 2000. If, on the other hand, the result is fairly definitive, then you will have unhappy people who may well go to court, but they will have a whole lot less grounds to stand on. But I want to make it very clear that many people, perhaps as many as half of all voters in the country, by the time Election Day happens on Tuesday, they will have already voted, either by advance voting or by vote by mail. Just as you said, in the state of Washington, the number is considerable because basically you don't show up on Election Day in the state of Washington to vote. It's all handled ahead of time. What that means is all the campaigning that's happening now for those people who've already voted, this is water under the bridge. Because their mind was already made up. They made their mark, they mailed off their ballot, or they dropped it off at the ballot drop-off box, and now they're simply waiting to see what's going to happen rather than scratching their head and trying to make up their minds. And what this means further is that turnout is important. And what I mean by turnout, of course, is people who decide to go vote on election day from among those people who are going to vote in person. And there is where the campaigns are still trying to recruit the last possible number of people. I don't think it's mostly trying to convince people to vote for me versus the other person or vice versa. It's much more a function of me trying to convince voters to get up off their sofa, off their couch, and go spend some time standing in line to cast their vote. Because America has a fairly low rate of actual voting. It's higher than it is in South Africa, but it's lower than it is in Australia, where it's a legal requirement. The average on a presidential election year is somewhere around 60% of eligible voters, which means that there are a fair number of people who either chose not to vote or couldn't care.
Yeah, you know, I want to actually just go into some of what you've written in a piece that you did quite recently for the Daily Maverick, and it was about, you know, talking about how we are a week, at that point you'd written it a week towards this election. And one wonders now that we have, 48 hours, perhaps just under that before that election kicks off and sees its fruition. One wonders what is going through the minds, but also actively what the candidates could be doing. I mean, one of the things that we heard earlier from our reporter on the ground is just the spectacular sort of pageantry of the campaigning of both candidates, right? One appearing on Saturday Night Live, and then, of course, you know, recently a Donald Trump inside a McDonald's franchise and all of that. But towards the last few days, things that you think we really can expect, because in the run-up to it, that certainly we can all agree that we didn't even expect to see the attempted assassination, for instance, on the life of Donald Trump. So what we can expect in the last 2 days from the two candidates?
Well, I'm tempted to be a little bit snarky and say absolute exhaustion, because they have been running, you know, full tilt for weeks and weeks now. Going from one state to the next, and one event from next to the next, in an effort to get their point across and encourage people to support them. But I think Kamala Harris, for example, has effectively wound up her campaign in terms of ideas and issues, and now it's simply the exhortations to crowds, please show up and vote if you haven't already mailed in or delivered a ballot. And in Donald Trump's case, it's keeping up the enthusiasm for people that he is targeting. And it's interesting to point to one of the things that the Trump campaign is focusing on are voters who historically have not voted, or younger voters, in this case mostly younger men without university educations, who have a low propensity to pay attention to the election, A, and B, to vote. And so this goes back to my earlier comment of turnout. Turnout is the golden objective at this point, to see if you can convince everybody who is in your corner to actually vote rather than simply to gripe and complain.
Yeah, one of the things that you've written about, and I'm actually going to read from your piece, if you'd allow me, the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Please. And strong support for Israel by the current administration in that conflict has made a number of those people, Muslim people in American communities, increasingly wary of supporting Kamala Harris. This is significant because in one of the states considered a swing state, and you write about it, Michigan, has something to the order of, and I'm reading, 300,000 Muslim or Arab American citizens. So the issue of the war in the Middle East, a very important one for Kamala Harris, and certainly for Donald Trump.
Well, in point of fact, in the surveys that talk about what are the issues of most importance for voters, they are in order: the issue of immigration, the issue of the national economy and its effect on people's cost of living, women's reproductive rights, and a newer one that Harris brought into the equation, the defense of democracy. Traditionally, international relations issues, unless it's a war in which the country is actively engaged in and its soldiers are fighting, rank very low. And in this case, nationally, the war in Ukraine and the war and the conflict in the Middle East are much lower on the list of things that, in fact, environmental and climate issues are ranked higher. But the reason why you read that portion is because of the particular circumstances in the state of Michigan,
Yep.
which is one of those swing states. And there is that percentage of the population, perhaps 300,000 adult citizens who could vote and who are caught in the middle of a kind of personal agony about whether they should stay with their traditional support of Democratic candidates or whether they should break with that and perhaps not vote at all or or vote for a small party, third party candidate. I think it's very unlikely that any of those people would elect to support Donald Trump simply because he has made a point of saying that he is the most important figure in America in support of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I don't think that sits well with the Arab/Muslim community in Michigan. The thing that I'm watching, that I will be watching over the next couple of days, obviously, is the way voting in the suburban areas of the swing states. Take Pennsylvania, for example. The suburban ring around the city of Philadelphia and the one around the city of Pittsburgh, two major cities in that state. There are a large number of votes in those suburban areas. Long ago, some of those were traditionally Republican. Now, many of them are Democratic leaning. And if the percentages go to the level that they would have gone with Joe Biden in the last election, it may well be secured for Kamala Harris, the state of Pennsylvania. If that percentage, those numbers drop down below that level, that spells trouble. Michigan we've talked about that to some degree. And the other places to pay attention to are Wisconsin, North Carolina, where your reporter is paying close attention on the ground, Georgia in the south, further south from North Carolina, and then Arizona and Nevada. That constitutes the list. There are some people who joke that the election may well depend on a couple of thousand voters in a suburban county just outside of Philadelphia. So just several thousand people in Bucks County or Montgomery County. That may be a little harsh, but that points to the way in which a swing state that is definitely divided between the two candidates will move one way or the other from just a small number of people.
Yeah, well, I can tell you this, it's going to be a busy week as we look at what all those various states do in the run-up to this election. And, of course, as the voting and the counting continues. Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it, and a good week ahead. I know you're going to be very busy as well. Brooks Spector there, international relations expert. And, of course, he's also associate editor with the Daily Maverick.